The mechanic in Ash Springs that worked greasy knuckled magic to get my bike running again only charged me $50 and told me he thought it was probably just vapor lock, score one for the red-haired waitress. But he also said that he didn't know much about Hondas. When I asked him what I should do, he said, buy a Harley, laughed at his own joke, and then said, avoid the heat as best you can, find a Honda dealership in Vegas, they'll know better than me. So on his advice, I was on the road by 6:30 the next morning heading south. My plan was to ride early before the mercury got too crazy and hide in a Vegas Honda dealership during the worst of the heat. The only problem was that the ride from Ash Springs to Vegas was a solid 100 miles of sagebrush and Joshua trees. And if I'd been nervous about riding in the desert before, then after the breakdown, I was tinfoil hat paranoid. I'd never been so in tune with every noise my bike made, from the hum of the tires to the growl of the engine to the thwack of bugs splattering on my face shield. Any noise not in perfect harmony put me in a frantic search for shade. More than once, the change in the sound from my tires because of a difference in the quality of the road surface was enough to give me a panic attack. I spent the entire 100-plus mile ride scanning the desert for places that might offer some sort of shelter should my bike suddenly crap out again. For every tree or shrub taller than a couple of feet, I made a mental note. Every bridge or culvert became a potential home. Every time I passed a town, house, or abandoned shack, I checked my odometer so I'd know how far I'd have to walk the next time I broke down. I repeated the distances to myself as I rode until I sounded like Rain Man, 4 miles to the culvert, 3 miles to the big Joshua tree, definitely 5 miles to the bridge. By the time I hit Vegas, I was so tense that my neck and shoulders burned as if they had lines of electric fencing running through them. I would have given anything for a massage, but there was no time or money for that. I needed to find a motorcycle dealership in the hope that their mechanics could squeeze me in. There were a couple of problems with that. First, Vegas was massive, almost 2 million people crammed in a jumble of asphalt and concrete, a sprawling mass of honking horns and sweating tourists, where you could just about go blind from the sunlight reflecting off the glass. All the motion and noise combined to overwhelm my brain that had gotten used to being alone in the mountains and desert. Secondly, I had no way to find a dealership. Despite the fact that the rest of the world was well into the age of smartphones, I was still using an old flip phone that had been outdated when I bought it. At the start of the trip, it had been on its last legs, and a couple of thousand miles getting battered in my front pocket hadn't done it any favors. It ground and crunched when open, and specks of Portland cement had somehow worked their way behind the glass. The little white dots on the black screen looked like stars in the night sky. It wasn't any good for finding a motorcycle shop, but it still worked relatively well making and receiving calls, and that was normally good enough for me. I could either wander the city until I happened upon a Honda shop, or I could call someone who had internet access and have him give me directions. The first option, frankly, sucked. It meant riding around a busy city I'd never been in, with my eyes constantly looking above the oncoming traffic for a Honda sign that may or may not exist, all while not getting run over by some asshole too busy hooker hunting to notice 600 pounds of motorcycle in front of him. I hated riding in normal cities. Too many drivers had licenses they'd earned in games of Rochambeau, so I definitely wasn't about to cruise around a tourist magnet like Vegas with one eye on the skyline. I'd already pushed my luck with camping in cougar country and hitchhiking in kidnapper mobiles. I wasn't about to stretch it further and end up getting smoked by some fanny pack wearer trying to take a picture with his cell phone while knee driving his rented Tahoe down the strip. That left only one option. I called home. As it turned out, I may have been better off wandering the city. The first set of directions my brother gave me had 14 steps, beginning with sending me the wrong way down a one-way street. And when I wrote them on my clutch hand, they blacked out my palm from thumb to pinky. I didn't make it to my lifeline before I was lost, but instead of pulling over as soon as I knew I wasn't in the right place, I wandered the city for half an hour getting progressively more screwed. I drove around Vegas for so long that by the time I finally gave in and called home again, I was further away from the dealership than when I started. Fortunately, the second set of directions was short, simple, and easy to follow. They would have been perfect if they had actually led me anywhere near a motorcycle shop. Instead, they brought me to a smoked glass building with a parking lot filled with cars with hood ornaments worth more than my bike. Inside, I found a room filled with suit and tie wearing job applicants, scribbling on clipboards and stealing quick glances at the crazy bearded man covered in bits of dead bugs and carrying what looked like all his worldly possessions on his back. After a brief phone call where I accused my brother of intentionally screwing with me for some long ago childhood grudge, which, in retrospect, kinda funny, his third set of directions finally brought me to a dealership on the outskirts of Vegas. Rows of expensive cruisers and sport bikes filled the showroom, with an occasional four-wheeler or dirt bike to break up the monotony of gleaming chrome and spotless paint. One side of the building was stacked with all the gear a biker might ever conceivably need. There were racks of jackets and chaps, an entire wall dedicated to gloves, helmets that, with their sharp angles and styled paint, looked to be speeding despite the fact they sat on shelves. Moving through this maze of consumerism was a crack team of salesmen dressed smartly in polo shirts and khakis, all doing their best not to make eye contact with me. I knew I hit a new level of road grime when I walked through the entire dealership without a single salesman trying to hawk me a new cruiser, helmet, or pair of skull-shaped valve caps. I found the service department tucked away in a back corner with a kid manning the computer who looked like he was breaking child labor laws by sitting behind the desk. Not even old enough to have adolescent acne problems, he wore a mechanic's work shirt with his name stitched on the chest, but looked more like a little kid playing dress-up in his father's work clothes than an actual mechanic. He was friendly, which was a sure sign he hadn't been working long enough to know to hate customer service yet. "Hey," I said, stepping up to the counter. "I don't have an appointment or anything, I'm just passing through, but I'm having bike issues and I was hoping someone could take a look at it for me." "Sure, what's the problem?" the kid said. "Well, it's actually running fine now," I said, "but yesterday I was coming down around Rachel and the thing just cut out on me." "What kind of bike do you have?" "It's a Shadow Saber 1100. Noticing that he wasn't writing any of this down, I was already frustrated, thinking about having to repeat all this to the real mechanic when he came out. "Okay, just pull up to the side door and I'll be right with you," he said, and walked through the employees only door into the garage. Did he just say he would be right with me? Until then, I'd assumed he was just the service desk receptionist. As I went to get my bike, I wasn't sure how I felt about letting someone so young tinker with something where a simple malfunction could have me dying the death of a million flattened squirrels. I knew I shouldn't judge him solely based on the fact that he looked like he was years away from getting hair in strange places and funny feelings about girls, but he looked nothing like the image of a mechanic I had. In my mind, mechanics had grease under their nails, a pack of Camels surgically attached to one hand, and a permanent scowl from all the stupid people in the world who couldn't fix their own damn problems. "What's he mean that he'll meet you at the side door?" "He's gonna take a look at my bike." "Fuck that, tell him to get a real mechanic." "Obviously, he is a mechanic." "Obviously, he's an 8th grader." "I'm sure he's qualified." "I'm sure he just got out of underoos." "Maybe he's like a savant, like Mozart with a wrench. They wouldn't have him working here if he didn't know what he was doing." "You say that now. Wait until he comes out carrying a Fisher-Price tool set with a plastic hammer and a drill that makes real work noises." The kid mechanic waited for me at the side door without any tools in hand, real or plastic. I pulled up next to him and he told me to put it in neutral and leave the engine running. I did as I was told, then stepped to the side and watched him work. Hunching down on his ankles, his face scrunched in concentration as he gave the bike a once-over. "That's the exact same face you made on the side of the road yesterday." The child mechanic cocked his head to one side, the better to hear the pipes apparently, revved the engine twice and said, "Sounds like it's running fine to me." "Yeah, like I said, it's running fine now," I said, quickly losing whatever hope I had in my prepubescent mechanic. "I'm just worried that I'm going to get out in the desert and break down again." "That would suck," he said, peering into the bike's inner workings. "Huh? Have him repeat that, because all the technical jargon that he's obviously picked up after years of experience is going way over my head." Yes, it would," I said, trying not to give in to my negative side. "Where were you when you broke down?" he asked. "Up around Rachel." "It give you any warning?" "Not really. It just acted like it was out of gas, but there was still plenty of fuel in the tank." Straightening up, he flicked the kill switch, leaving us in sudden silence. "I think you probably got a case of vapor lock," he said. That's exactly what the other mechanic and the waitress said. The kid obviously knows what he's talking about. The kid wiped his clean hands against one another. "That'll happen with these older bikes." Of course it's an older bike to him. He just escaped the womb. My older bike was barely 6 years out of the showroom, which made it brand new to someone in my economic class. So what can I do about it? I asked. He shrugged. Nothing. That wasn't quite the answer I was looking for. Look, we can adjust your jets for the high desert, he said, but then you'll just be screwed when you get back to normal elevation. So there's really nothing I can do? Bring lots of water and stop as often as you can, he said. He must have noticed that this wasn't the news I wanted to hear because he dropped his voice and said, hey, look, I can bring it inside, put it up on a lift, and tinker with it for a while if you want. But that'll get expensive, and in the end, I'll tell you the exact same thing. Vapor lock. I thanked him for his time and headed toward Arizona torn. Part of me was thrilled that 3,000 miles from home, I'd found an honest mechanic. When I was searching for the dealership, I'd had visions of a mechanic holding a smoldering Marlboro between scarred knuckles, looking me dead in the eyes and saying, the bad news is I had to replace the flux capacitor, long drag from cigarette, and those ain't cheap. I should have been happy that I'd found a place where the mechanic, seeing how little I knew and how far from home I was, didn't have cartoon dollar symbols flashing in his eyes. And part of me was. But another part of me would have loved to have the sugar pill confidence of believing that he'd fixed whatever had gone wrong and it wouldn't happen again. With that kind of placebo confidence, I could have ridden through the desert without judging every drainage ditch and overpass for future housing potential. Leaving Nevada, I headed for the south rim of the Grand Canyon, but before I hit the Arizona line, I made a detour to the Hoover Dam. At first, I wasn't going to bother with it and would have skipped it entirely if not for the fact that my route to the Grand Canyon took me near it. I had no desire to stop and see this massive block of concrete plugging up the Colorado River, but the kid mechanic had said to take breaks as often as possible, and the dam was as good a place as any. It may sound odd that I had no interest in experiencing something that drew 1 million visitors a year, but I just couldn't get excited about a concrete plug in a river. It didn't matter that this particular plug was enormous. Beavers built dams, and I had a personal policy of not getting too impressed by people accomplishing things a rodent had mastered. Not helping matters was the fact I'd already seen it. In the 70-plus years of its existence, the image of the Hoover Dam had become ingrained in the American culture. It showed up in commercials, movies, books, and posters. Its most common view came from downstream, looking north towards its massive concrete spillway. At the base of the spillway was the powerhouse, built to withstand bomb strikes, which housed 17 turbines that produced electricity for California, Nevada, and Arizona. The 726-foot-high dam held back Lake Mead, one of the largest man-made lakes in the world. Running over the top of the dam was a 2-lane road that used to be the main highway between Nevada and Arizona. It was iconic, and like most icons, I didn't think seeing it up close would do anything but disappoint. I followed the signs to a parking garage on the Nevada side and parked my bike in the shade on the first level next to a 3-foot-thick concrete support column. With the temperature around 100, just the thought of weaving through the flow of camera-wielding tourists with 50 pounds on my back made my legs and head ache. I wanted to leave my pack behind, but there was no safe from theft way to attach it to my bike. The only thing I could think to do was find a place to stash it. Slinging it off my back, I started looking for some inconspicuous space to hide it. Maybe there was a concrete column or exposed I-beam that no one would think to look behind. I had almost picked the perfect hiding spot when a rare moment of clarity came over me. It was post 9/11. I was standing on a national treasure, a water source that was vital for life in the desert, which the government was afraid would become a terrorist target, afraid enough to build a $220 million bridge bypass around the dam. And I was about to stick a giant, overstuffed, suspicious package near a weight-bearing column. You're gonna end up in Gitmo. In no mood for a bunch of awkward questions or even more awkward cavity search, I rebuckled my shoulder straps and joined the river of tourists walking over the dam. Like a lot of the major public works in America, Hoover Dam was built during the Great Depression. In some ways, a project like the Hoover Dam could only be undertaken in a time of national uncertainty. There was a massive pool of potential labor that could be had relatively cheaply. Workers would put up with intolerable conditions for fear of losing their jobs in such an economically unstable time. and politicians would vote for anything that appeared to create jobs. In some way, not much had changed from the time of the Hoover Dam's construction to the 2011 Summer of Recovery. Beyond the 21,000 men who found paychecks during the Great Depression, building the dam was an inspiration to the country. It showed people what America was capable of and gave them hope for the future. This rallying around a single project during times of distress was a common thread throughout American history. The economic turmoil of the Great Depression had the Hoover Dam. The ideological fear of the Cold War was counterbalanced by the space program, and the cultural desert of the 80s had the shining beacon that was the Bud Bowl. Growing up, I always heard two legends about the Hoover Dam. The first was that there was so much concrete poured into the dam, it would take 125 years for it to fully cure. The second, related legend, was that the inside of the dam was speckled with the bodies of workers who died and been entombed inside the concrete. According to my always reliable schoolyard sources, it was a miracle that the outer wall of the dam wasn't covered with skeleton arms sticking out like spines on a cactus. It took all of 2 minutes of research to find out that both of these treasured childhood beliefs were bunk. I'm still holding on to the whole pop rocks and soda thing, though. Had Hoover been built in a single concrete pour, it would have taken 125 years for it to cure, but the dam wasn't built in a single pour. It couldn't have been for multiple reasons, including the fact that the sheer weight of that much wet concrete would have blown out just about any forms built to hold it, and the stresses from that much concrete curing all at once would have turned the Hoover Dam into the Hoover pile of rubble. Instead, the dam was built in a series of roughly 215 5-foot-tall blocks built in columns. Each block was poured individually, filled by 4 and 8-yard dump buckets, unloading concrete into each form. Each bucket only raised the level of concrete in the form by at most 6 inches, which would have made it difficult for all but the most determined suicides. The legend of the workers entombed inside the dam probably came from the fact that so many people died while building it. Officially, 96 people died constructing the dam. Unofficially, that number was way higher. The official number didn't take into account people like J.G. Tierney and Harold Connolly, who drowned in the river while making geological surveys for the dam. In a weird coincidence, Tierney's son Patrick would die while working on the Hoover Dam 13 years to the day later. The official numbers also didn't include anyone who died off-site after being injured on-site, or the 42 workers who died of, quote, pneumonia during construction. Many of these pneumonia deaths just happened to occur to people who worked in the diversion tunnels, which were constantly filled with exhaust fumes and could get as hot as 140 degrees. Six Companies, Inc., the company responsible for building the dam, didn't have to pay compensation to workers who died of pneumonia. But I'm sure that had nothing to do with all the pneumonia deaths on site. In another weird coincidence, there were no reported pneumonia deaths in nearby Boulder City at the same time. To those in charge of its building, a feat of construction as massive as the Hoover Dam needed some sort of artistic flourish. Apparently, it wasn't enough to have a giant concrete monolith in the middle of the desert that controlled flooding, produced power for 3 states, took the lives of well over 100 workers, and basically made the desert livable. So the government hired someone to jazz it up a bit. That job went to artist Oscar J.W. Hansen. On either side of a 142-foot flagpole sat 30-foot-tall winged figures that Hansen called the Winged Figures of the Republic. For an artist, he wasn't very creative in his naming. The statues were basically human figures with late-night infomercial abs seated on blocks of black diorite, their arms raised straight up and turned into wings, which looked a lot like giant bronze chef's knives. To my completely untrained eye, they resembled the kind of statues I'd expect to see in ancient Egypt. According to Hansen, they were an expression of the immutable calm of intellectual resolution and the enormous power of trained physical strength, equally enthroned in placid triumph of scientific accomplishment. Standing in the hot sun, looking up at the 4+ tons of bronze that made up both figures, I could honestly say that wasn't what I got. To me, the statues looked like the artist's attempt to screw with future archaeologists, who, thousands of years in the future, after our civilization ends, will find these Egyptian statues more than 7,000 miles away from the Nile and have their minds completely blown. That wasn't too much of a stretch of the imagination because, along with Mount Rushmore, the mountain vault that holds our nuclear waste, and packing peanuts, the Hoover Dam will outlive our civilization. With that in mind, the floor surrounding the base of the two winged figures was built with a star chart showing the exact astrological positions of the stars on the day that Franklin D. Roosevelt dedicated the dam, September 30th, 1935, for the record. That way, future generations with no knowledge of our language could accurately tell when the dam was built, and possibly what our lucky lotto numbers were. I wandered around the top of the dam, allowing myself to get caught up in the flow of tourists, snapping pictures of the artwork and structures, and doing my best not to ruin anyone's pictures by walking through. It was harder than it sounds because everyone had a camera and they took pictures of everything. The massive intake towers, the bronze statues, the inside of the snack bar. A high percentage of the visitors were foreign tourists, and bits of Chinese, French, Italian, and German meshed together. Hearing so many languages and understanding none of them reminded me of that old joke. What do you call someone who speaks 3 languages? Trilingual. What do you call someone who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call someone who speaks 1 language? American. As I moved around these groups of people, I could hear the excitement in their voices even if I couldn't understand what they were saying. But that excitement didn't translate into me. Standing on this triumph of American willpower and determination, I didn't see an amazing feat of engineering. I didn't see a testament to man's struggle over the seemingly impossible. I didn't see humankind's innate desire to control and tame nature taken to the extreme. Without a doubt, all those things were present in that massive block of concrete and steel, but that wasn't what came to my mind as I stood on this piece of construction that will outlive all the nations currently on the planet. When I looked at the Hoover Dam, I saw hell. Before my advanced studies in make-believe, I shoveled cow shit, ran chainsaws, framed walls, laid roofs, and macheted my way through thick northern Maine forests and fetid Boston swamps, one of which turned a good portion of my left foot brown for 2 years. Those jobs got me heat stroke, frostbite, taken to the hospital strapped in the back of an ambulance, and forced me to do basic surgery on myself in a hotel bathroom with nothing but a bottle of hydrogen peroxide and a handful of Q-tips. And I would gladly go back to any one of them than do concrete work. Concrete work was messy, heavy, and hard. It had to be mixed, poured, vibrated, finished, and refinished. You were always racing to get it done before it started to set, and the hotter it was, the quicker it set. When the Hoover Dam was being built, the average summer high was 119.9 degrees. Steel reinforcing bars stuck out like metal punji sticks, waiting to stab and tear flesh. And if all that wasn't enough, concrete ate skin. The mixture was so basic, as opposed to acidic, that if left on bare flesh long enough, it eventually eat away at the skin. An old farmer's trick to avoid concrete-chewed fingers involved washing your hands in vinegar to even out the pH. It made you smell like an Italian sandwich, but at least you didn't end up with zombie hands. In all the concrete pours I'd done, not once did I walk away not exhausted, sore, and drained. I'd been fortunate that all my pours had been relatively small, 1 and 2 day affairs, a week at most, of no more than a few yards at a time. I couldn't imagine pouring 4,360 yards, enough to pave a 16-foot wide road from New York to San Francisco in 120-degree heat with bosses who didn't care if you died because there was a line of desperate people waiting to take your spot. Maybe it was that I'd seen so many pictures of the dam, or my pity for the poor bastards who built it, or my rodent policy that kept me from truly appreciating what had been called one of the top 10 construction achievements of the 20th century. But while I couldn't get too excited about the Hoover Dam, I was blown away by the Mike O'Callaghan Pat Tillman Memorial Bridge. I'd never seen any pictures of the bridge before, maybe because it was completed less than a year before my trip and hadn't had time to become part of the national consciousness. Set roughly 1,500 feet downstream from the dam, the 1,900-foot-long bridge spanned 900 feet above the Colorado River. 4 lanes and a sidewalk held above a 1,060-foot concrete arch by concrete pillars as long as 300 feet. The arch was actually 2 separate arches running parallel and connected together by steel struts. Starting on both sides of the canyon, they were built from 106 separate pieces that eventually met in the middle. In a streak of engineering genius and in the interest of keeping the bridge from becoming the kind of traffic snarl that the top of the dam had become, the bridge's sidewalls were built too tall to see over in a vehicle. The highest and longest arched concrete bridge in the Western Hemisphere, with the tallest concrete columns of their kind in the world, it took 1,200 workers and 300 engineers just under 6 years to finish. Even though they were made out of the same materials, stone, sand, cement, and steel, a dam was basically just a blockage in the artery of a river, while a bridge was a magic trick. Built of heavy concrete and metal that wanted nothing more than to crash to the earth, a bridge held them aloft, keeping them in the air against their very nature. It wasn't the pillars or the arches that impressed so much as the spaces between them, allowing wind and birds to play inside the structure. You wouldn't think that, with all that open air, the bridge was even capable of standing. The Mike O'Callaghan Pat Tillman Memorial Bridge, named after Mike O'Callaghan, a Korean War vet and 2-term governor of Nevada, and Pat Tillman, a former Arizona Cardinal linebacker who, after 9/11, turned down a multi-million-dollar contract to join the Army and was eventually killed in the war in Afghanistan, looked like a piece of art compared to the massive block of concrete that was the Hoover Dam. Leaving the dam behind, I did my best to follow the child mechanic's advice and stopped along the way as often as possible. The only problem with that was there weren't any more places worth stopping for in the Arizona desert than there had been in the Nevada desert. Still, I visited every gas station and convenience store I came to. Even if I didn't need gas, I'd buy a drink and nurse it in the parking lot in the hopes that it'd give my bike a chance to cool down some. Most of the places I stopped were typical gas stations. Nondescript buildings staffed by bored employees selling high fructose corn syrup drinks and fatty snacks in bright plastic packaging. I was just getting used to the idea of a dull day in the desert when, riding through the middle of nowhere, I came across a building with the most personality this side of a funhouse. It was a pretty standard 1-story building, but instead of the normal red, yellow, or blue paint job, the entire outside was covered in paintings. A Sasquatch. Technically, I think it was Harry from Harry and the Hendersons, the Terminator, Dan Aykroyd and Jim Belushi in their Blues Brothers suits, a big rig, Ghost Riders, a bandit, Indian warriors, and a chief in full headdress the size of a Volkswagen Beetle covered the outside walls. There were a couple of gas pumps and the building was split between a tourist junk shop, the kind of friendly place where bathrooms are for paying customers only signs were taped to every available surface, and a restaurant. At the gas pump, a home-printed flyer advertising a, quote, world-famous hamburger flapped at me in the hot wind. Thinking that this was as good a place as any to hide from the sun for an hour, I parked my bike and went inside. The store was crammed full of every piece of desert tourist crap imaginable, shelf upon shelf of, quote, Native American goods and artwork, some of which still had their, quote, made in China tags, filled the floor. Overpriced t-shirts, shot glasses, and snow globes in the desert, for some reason, covered just about every inch of available space. Behind the counter, a clerk glared at the milling customers as if she was daring them to try and pocket one of the fake arrowheads, or just ask to use the bathroom without buying a $3 Snickers bar first. I hightailed it out of there as quickly as possible before I accidentally turned too fast and my pack knocked over a bookshelf filled with priceless native artifacts that had been authentically made in a factory in Taiwan. The restaurant was much more to my liking, dark and cool with no natural light. More of a dive bar than a diner, the place was filled with vinyl seats and had strings of dusty, cardboard beer advertisements hanging from the ceiling. On my table sat a clear plastic standee preaching the virtues of the same, quote, world-famous burger I'd seen on the gas pump. The waitress, an older woman who'd spent too much time in the sun, came by my table, not to take my order, but to drop off a beer coaster and a second, laminated square of paper roughly the same size and shape as a beer coaster. Picking it up, I looked confused, so she said, "If you need to use the bathroom, you just make sure you take that with you." Just what I wanted to handle right before I ate. Something untold numbers of strangers had brought into the shitter. With my pinky, I slid it to the far corner of the table. Apparently, this place took their bathrooms are for paying customers only policy to heart. Part of me wanted to see what kind of Mad Max reject they had sitting out front of the men's room like a bouncer at a nightclub, carding sufferers of the full bladder, but I was too hungry to follow through. "What can I get you?" the waitress asked. "Can I have a chicken sandwich and a water, please?" I asked, picking the one healthy item from the menu. Eating healthy on a road trip was about as realistic as cold water fusion, but I thought I should at least try to make an effort. It seemed like every place I stopped pushed fatty fried meat bits and greasy potatoes, and every time I tried to order something healthy, something would get in the way. 2 days before, I'd settled on a chicken Caesar salad wrap, but when the waitress brought it out, it was drenched in so much ranch dressing that I could have slurped it up with a straw. My health food kick wasn't just because I didn't want to have open heart surgery before I hit 30. Spending hours with a gut full of grease on a vibrating motorcycle seat wasn't what psychologists would refer to as a healthy life choice. "No," she said. At first, I thought she was trying to be cute, and I had no interest in flirting with a woman who had 30 years on me. But I was hungry, so I said, "Pretty, please?" "You don't want the chicken sandwich," she said so matter-of-factly that I had to wonder what horrible thing they'd done to that chicken. "You can have chicken anywhere. You want our burger. They're world famous." She pointed at the plastic standee as if that was an impartial expert testimonial. "Honestly," I said, "I've eaten a ton of burgers over the last few days, and I'm trying to eat a little healthy." "No, you can eat healthy somewhere else," the waitress kept up her pitch. "I can tell that you're not from around here. An easy guess since, as far as I could tell, the gas station restaurant was the only building in 20 miles. So this is probably your one chance to try our burger." I sighed, thinking that anything a waitress pushed that hard had to be good, or about to spoil. "Okay, cheeseburger it is." She smiled and disappeared into the back, and 20 minutes later she dropped a plate on the table covered in a burger and fries and stood back to watch me take my first bite. I picked up their world-famous burger, took a bite, and my mouth flooded with the taste of average. It wasn't the worst burger I had on the trip. That honor went to a meal at a strange little diner in Virginia. I didn't bite into the skeleton of a kangaroo rat or pull a long black hair from between my teeth, but it sure as hell wasn't world-famous quality. It tasted almost exactly like a Wendy's fast food burger. In my book, it was a solid C, but when I looked up at her with my mouth full of acceptable, I had to lie. She was so excited to have me try this burger because, in her world, this was a really great thing. She wasn't pushing it for a tip or because the owners told her to. In her mind, this wad of ground up cow meat was so amazing she was obligated to tell other people about it. Who was I to crap on that? "You're right," I said, wiping a napkin across my lips. "It's great." She nodded and smiled as if to say of course she was, then left me to finish my world-famously adequate beef patty.